Just then, Qing, who was kneeling behind Shilian, spoke up grimly. His Highness did indeed mention it a couple of days ago. All eyes went to him. Qing continued. Recently, His Highness has been putting a lot of thought into the heavenly procession, and yesterday he suddenly came up with the extraordinary idea of jumping off the tower to simulate celestial descent without changing anything else in the program. At the time, His Highness was in the middle of rehearsals and couldn't get away, so he sent Qing to pass on word to Guo to request for the go-ahead. He raised his head, obvious anger in his eyes. Qing returned and told His Highness that Guo had been informed, so His Highness performed today under the impression that he had gotten permission. Who knew that Guo had not known, and this almost ruined the event? The cultivators all looked at each other. Guo asked, "Who knew of this?" The other three Deputy Guo shook their heads, all denying knowing anything. Guo turned to Qing, his cloudy expression turning into one of anger. "Qing, you intentionally withheld communication?" His words and expression showed that he already firmly believed Qing to be sabotaging the affair on purpose. Shilian glanced at the silent, expressionless youth kneeling on the side and pondered before speaking up. "Guo, I think that there must be some kind of misunderstanding." Hearing this, Qing shifted his eyes to stare at Shilian, his gaze going dark. Shilian said, "If he had purposely held back word, once the event was over and we compared notes, his deceit would be revealed, and there'd be no way he could escape taking responsibility. Qing is not a short-sighted imbecile, and he wouldn't have come up with such a low tactic. Besides, with the God-pleasing martial warrior missing, what advantage does a ghost opponent even have? Please hear him out, Guo, and then draw a conclusion." Finishing his speech, Shilian inclined his head. "Tell us, Qing, what happened?" Qing lowered his eyes and said softly, "I did pass on word on what His Highness bade me to say yesterday." Guo frowned. "Won't we know ourselves what you did or did not say? When did you tell us?" "Yesterday, an hour after the evening lesson, when the 4 masters were resting at the Sixiang Pavilion, this disciple spoke from outside the window." Guo turned his head to his 3 fellows, looking puzzled. "Yesterday, after the evening lessons? What were we doing then?" The moment the question left his lips, he remembered, and his face turned slightly blue from awkwardness. The other 3 Deputy Guo also coughed nervously. Their responses ambiguous. Not really anything, just resting is resting. Seeing how the Guo stammered, everyone immediately understood. The Royal Holy Pavilion was a place of quiet meditation and training, and there was very little entertainment. There were only some small games that could be counted as amusement. One of them, the most popular one, was playing cards. Cards could be played secretly, to be seen by no one. The Guo had long been bored out of their minds residing at the Royal Holy Pavilion, and so they were heavily addicted. When they started playing, they would forget everything and everyone, falling into a state akin to obsession or drunkenness, uncontrollably emotional, and definitely not able to hear anything from outside. If Qing had said anything at the time, what could they possibly have heard? One of the Deputy Guo said, "Oh, maybe there were too many people and your voice was too low and we didn't hear. Or, we didn't hear clearly." Guo demanded suspiciously, "Did you actually go to the Sixiang Pavilion yesterday?" "I absolutely did," Qing said, and as proof, he relayed the dress, look, and accent of the guard standing at the gate without fault. Guo had to believe him, but he still frowned. If you had gone to the Sixiang pavilion, you could have just passed on the message to the trainee outside the door, or enter the chamber and communicate in detail. Why speak outside by the window? You didn't even confirm whether or not we heard. Qing responded softly. It's not like I didn't try. This disciple had begged the Xixiong guarding the door, but for some reason that Xixiong had to make things difficult and wouldn't let me into the chamber or pass on word for me. His words were taunting, and he kicked me out. After a pause, he continued. This disciple had no other choice, so I went around to the other side of the Sixiang pavilion and tried to pass on the message through the window. After I spoke, I heard one of the Guo say, I understand, now leave. So this disciple took that as consent to His Highness's plans and returned. The Guo pursed their lips and didn't speak. At the height of a round of card games, who would pay attention to whatever was said outside? If they should hear anything, then of course they'd respond offhandedly with, I understand. But in reality, they probably didn't even know where the voice came from. Shilian knitted his brows. That such a thing would happen. Which trainee is this impudent? To be so disrespectful to one of my messengers. He's got guts. Although Shilian was usually kind and gentle when interacting with others at the Royal Holy Pavilion and never really put on airs, he was still nonetheless the esteemed son of the king, the prominent crown prince, and even as he knelt before the statue of God, he had not shown any meekness. In that moment of sternness, he was strong and authoritative without fury. Everyone stayed quiet, and the Guo wore unreadable expressions on their faces. Why didn't you report this to me when you returned yesterday? Shilian asked. Qing turned around while still kneeling and prostrated, his voice quiet. Your Highness, there's no need to look further into this matter with that Xixiong. I didn't say anything after returning yesterday, simply because I don't want to make this into a big deal. And seriously, it's nothing major. If your Highness was to defend me openly, then it'll hurt the friendliness amongst everyone. Shilian disagreed, sounding upset. What is this friendliness with everyone? The kind of friendliness you use to abuse others? Hearing this, the Guo sitting on the side looked even more agitated. At the end of the day, something like this happened because the Guo disliked Qing. Since they were displeased, then the trainee attendants naturally followed their lead. And truly, Qing himself wasn't that likable. So, often, not only did fellow trainees inconvenience him, they'd also make things difficult for him at every turn. Of course, this high and mighty disciple wasn't trying to be sarcastic, but he certainly did make a jab. Through his words, it was obvious that Qing was backing off, but Fengxin couldn't listen to another word and suddenly interjected. It really was nothing major, but you had to go and make it complicated. If you had told the trainee at the door that you went to deliver the message by His Royal Highness's command, would he still have been brave enough to block your way? Also, right before we departed today, Guo asked you where His Highness went. Why did you answer so vaguely? Couldn't you have said clearly that His Highness was on top of the tower, waiting for the procession to start? Qing immediately argued back, calmly and steadily. I thought Guo already knew and didn't expect to be asked that question, so I was confused. But right after, I told Guo His Highness had already said not to worry, and that the procession could start without delay as planned, that His Highness would be back promptly. His Highness might not have been there at the time, but there were so many people on site who heard me. So how can you say I did this intentionally, that I was being vague? Fengxin stared at him angrily. But if he thought about it in detail, Qing did indeed say what he said he did. Only Guo was too anxious and didn't want to make any hasty decisions. So if he must pick at faults, there really wasn't much to prove anything. Just then, Shilian spoke up again. All right. It's just an untimely misunderstanding. It's all just bad luck. So stop fighting. Fengxin looked extremely displeased, but mindful of his position, he dared not be noisy in the great martial hall, so he stopped talking. Guo also didn't want to pursue this topic any more. After all, if they must get to the bottom of things, wasn't he also at fault for being too engrossed in card games? Thus, he simply waved and sighed. Let's talk more later. We'll discuss more on what's transpired and think of a way to save the situation. The three of you are dismissed. Go remove your costumes and do whatever else you must. Shilian curtsied and rose to his feet. Fengxin and Qing both properly kowtowed once before rising, following behind Shilian, who was about to leave. Shilian had one foot over the threshold when he heard Guo speak up. Your Highness. Shilian turned his head. Both His Majesty the King and Her Ladyship the Queen asked after you today. If you have time over the next few days, go and see them, Guo said. Shilian smiled. I understand. After leaving the great martial hall, the three of them traversed through a large part of the summit and returned to the Shenle Palace training hall, built especially for the Crown Prince. Shilian could finally remove his ceremonial garb. As mentioned before, for the Shangyuan Heavenly Ceremonial Procession, the ceremonial attire of the God-pleasing martial warrior was exceedingly strict in every detail. Every accessory and fold had meaning, and could not ever be misarranged or mixed up. For example, the outer robe was to be white, symbolizing divine purity. The inner garb was to be red, symbolizing canonical tradition. The golden crown that fastened the hair symbolized royal power and wealth. White plumes hidden by the heart meant flight to ascension. Loose cordon ribbons along the sleeves meant to carry all lives, and so on. It would be easy to imagine that from head to toe, both to wear or to remove was no simple task. However, as the esteemed Crown Prince, naturally he didn't need to do anything himself. He only needed to stand and open his arms wide in that refreshing, fragrant chamber and chat with Fengxin while waiting on his personal attendant, Qing, to help remove layer after layer of this God-pleasing costume. That outer white robe of the God-pleasing costume was of high quality, the threads delicate and exquisite, the fringes sewn with intricate light golden patterns, elegant but not frivolous. In comparison, the black martial attire of the ghost costume was a difference of heaven and earth. Qing himself hadn't removed his black gear yet, his hands full with the God-pleasing costume that he had disrobed from Shilian. His fingers twitched, inconspicuously feeling up the material of the white robe. Next to him, Shilian removed the golden crown, letting his long hair loose, and sat down on the edge of his sandalwood bed, kicking off his snow-white boots, waiting for someone to bring him fresh clothes. He waited for a bit, but noticed that Qing wasn't moving, so he inclined his head. He asked, "What's wrong?" Qing instantly came to and replied, "The costume seems to be dirty in some places." Shilian awed and said, "Bring it over and let me see." Sure enough, on the snow-white attire were two distinct little black handprints. Shilian took a look and remarked, "It's possibly from that little kid who fell from the sky. I remember that he was grabbing onto me and wouldn't let go." That child's face was wrapped all over with bandages. Maybe he had tumbled elsewhere or something. "Fengxin, did you check him out?" Fengxin was just wrapping up the sword and the long saber and replied grimly, "No. I took him out of the palace and was about to take a look at his face as you asked, but he kicked me in the shin. It actually fucking hurt." Shilian fell over on the bed laughing, pointing at him. It must be because you're so mean. Otherwise how come he didn't kick me, but he kicked you? I wasn't, Fengxin cried. It was like that damned kid was possessed or something, and ran away really quickly. Or else I would have picked him up, upside down, and shook him until he cried from fright. Qing turned the white robe over in his hands. That kid must be a beggar. He's too dirty. Just a simple grab, and he could leave black prints like these. Your Highness, the god-pleasing costume can't be dirty. Isn't that also a bad omen? Shilian stayed in his lying position on the bed, and casually grabbed a book from the headboard, covering half of his face. 3 rounds around the capital. I've already got a good name going down in history with the best record. If it's dirty, it's dirty. Just wash it. After a pause, Qing replied quietly, I will do my best to be careful when I wash it. Shilian flipped through the book and came to the page illustrating the art of the saber, and recalled the exhilarating sparring earlier that day on the stage. He smiled. Qing, you fought well today on stage. Qing's shoulders tensed. Shilian continued, Only today did I find out that you're much more skilled with the saber than you are with the sword. Qing's expression relaxed, and he turned around. There was even a smile playing on his lips. Really? Yeah, Shilian answered, but you might have been too hasty. Swinging a saber is not like swinging a sword. Look here. The moment the topic shifted to martial arts, Shilian became highly enthusiastic, even more possessed than when the Guo played cards. He jumped off the bed without even putting on his shoes, demonstrating his point on the spot, using his hand as the pretend saber. Qing wore a complicated expression, but after Shilian demonstrated a few moves, he started to watch seriously. Fengxin, on the other hand, swung the now properly wrapped, long saber and chased Shilian back onto the bed, shouting, If you're going to show off, at least put on your shoes before you do. You're the crown prince, hair loose and feet bare. What a disgrace. Shilian was just at the height of his excitement, but then got chased onto the bed like a duck to the pen, and was rather bitter. All right, geez, he said, and ran through his long hair with both hands, ready to tie it up before continuing his lecture to Qing. Suddenly he frowned. That's weird, he said. What is it? Fengxin asked.